Okay, good evening to everyone. Good morning to all of you all around the world. St. Petersburg just excites me. I've been there a number of times. It is a beautiful city. It has stunning architecture and a very dynamic history. It is a city of great artistic achievement and violent political upheaval. St. Petersburg was one of the later established cities within Russia. It was established and named after Tsar Peter the Great in 1703, and it remained the capital of Russia for some 206 years. Now, in the beginning, it was called St. Petersburg by the Tsars, and it is called that today as well. And that was the original name, as I said, for some 206 years. In 1914, at the beginning of the Great War, St. Petersburg was seen as, well, had much too much of a German name, considering that Russia was at war with Germany. And therefore, they changed the name to Petrograd, which it stayed from 1914 to 1924. Bolshevik Revolution under Lenin between 1924 and 1991. And somehow the change of names of a city implies a lot about the history of that city. Now let us start with a quote, a beautiful quote. It is a city wrapped in silence, made magical by that mysterious light of the white knights of Russia. And to anyone from Britain will recognize the name of Emily Pankhurst, who made that quote, as it were, in 1917. Emily Pankhurst was a British political activist. She was sponsored by our then Prime Minister David Lloyd George to convince the Russians to stay in the war and stay fighting against Germany. Also, as a suffragette, to further promote her feminist agenda and encourage women to support the war effort. Her line reflects very much the poetry of Alexander Pushkin, the greatest of all Russian poets. Now, St. Petersburg was established in the area where you can see on the map because the Russians, or the Russian Empire, needed an outlet, as it were, to that area of the Baltic Sea, toward Finland, all over there. And it is the far west of Russia, and it is some 500 miles south of the Arctic Circle, and is situated on the Neva River. And the Neva River would be an essential essence of the history as time would continue through. And it winds around, in fact, the area of St. Petersburg contains some 44 islands. There are 44 islands make up that city. So when visiting the city, it is always a bit like a small Venice and full of waterways. Now, St. Petersburg was seen as Russia's window on Europe. And the Tsar named the city after Christ's first apostle, who was his patron saint. And one of the first buildings which was built, as you can see in front of you here, is the Peter and Paul Fortress on Hare Island. This was part and parcel of Peter's, but also many of the Tsar's love affair with European art, European architecture, and European culture. And here one can see the impressive Peter and Paul Cathedral. It was one of the tallest Russian Orthodox Church bell towers and is topped with a gilded guardian angel. Now, the fortress itself is the burial place, or became the burial place, of the Tsars from the 18th century onwards, and includes the Tsar Peter the Great, and all the way through to Catherine the Great, and includes the burial places of the last Tsar, Nicholas II, and his family. And he was only interred around 1998, following a lot in the Orthodox Church concerning the authenticity of the remains of the Tsar's family. Were they actually burying the body, the bones of Tsar Nicholas II and his family, or were the bones of someone else? But eventually he was buried in this site. Now, lesser known, you may well ask here about the Jewish inclusion in this matter at this moment. Lesser known is that, of course, within Petersburg fortress was a prison, and the prison existed from 1718, so it's just 15 years after the foundation of the city. Now, a few Jews were allowed to live in St. Petersburg since the 18th century. More Jews, what she called useful Jews, to live in that city. The number of Jews increased, and by the 18th century, or the end of the 18th century, not only were there regular Jews, but they had a number of Hasidim as well. Now, Shneur Zalman of Liadi may well be known more to people as the Alter Rebbe, who is the founder of the Hasidic movement Chabad Lubavitch, and the names are interchangeable. Now, during his highly influential leadership, he clashed. The Jewish world was not at peace with each other, and the Hasidim, who rose in the 18th century, were at a type of war with Lithuanian Jewry of the Vilna Gaon. And eventually, the Vilna Gaon and others of his supporters would write about the Hasidim in a most vicious way, and they would reply, the Hasidim would reply to the Lithuanian Jews in also a vicious way. Eventually, Lithuanian Jewry attacked Shneur Zalman of Liadi, the founder of the Chabad movement, and stated that he was supporting the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire at the time, at the end of the 18th century, was, of course, the enemy of Russia. But the land of Israel was within the Ottoman Empire. Therefore, the Hasidim, who were known for giving charitable donations to the land of Israel, were directly or indirectly giving charitable donations to the Ottoman Empire. So when he was accused, therefore, of giving charity and money to the Ottoman Empire, he was arrested and imprisoned in this very area of the fort. Now, the prison he stayed for some 53 days before he was released. And on that day of the release of Shneur Zalman of Liadi, the founder of the Chabad movement, from the prison, is still to this day, 200 years and more onwards, is celebrated as a great day and celebration. In 1800, he was again arrested with his son on this occasion, Moshe, and again was eventually released, but after many, many weeks. Now, if one sees areas of St. Petersburg and visits the palaces, there is magnificence upon magnificence, beauty upon beauty. There is stunning works, and one of them is the most stunning Peterhof Palace. It is designed as the center of peace of Peter the Great's Russian Versailles, and the Russians often, and the Tsars often look toward France for inspiration, for culture, for literature, for ideas, for buildings, and this is what they did. And therefore, when they constructed Peterhof Palace, it was not simply called Peterhof Palace, but was called the Russian Versailles, and was seen as a response to the Palace of Versailles in France. The building was completed in 1721 and enhanced further by his daughter Elizabeth. Unsurprisingly, when you look at this slide and see the magnificence of the amount of gold, which was restored, interestingly enough, by Russia in the world where they would be against capitalism and this exuberance of gold, nonetheless, they restored it to somehow bring about the past of the Tsars and bring in tourists. And this palace was eventually became one of the great UNESCO World Heritage Sites. Now, the water fountain is particularly interesting here on the slide because the water here blasts up into the air without the use of any mechanical pump. It is entirely operated by the way that the water and the land lies which can, by its own, in its own way, pump the water upwards. Now, in a city, and this is the gardens of it, I mean, it's just absolutely magnificent. In a city that exudes beauty and gold is what is known as the Amber Room. And this is in the Catherine Palace and is named, or the palace is named, after the wife of Peter the Great, who we met as being the founder of the city of St. Petersburg, and who ruled Russia but for 2 years. And she, in Tsarskoye Selo, was inspired to have this particular amber room, which is an extremely expensive way of doing a room. And amber is particularly expensive. Now, again, this was to rival Versailles. And one of the rooms of the palace is the legendary amber room, which contains within it 450 kilograms of amber, enhanced with mosaics, as you can see, and gemstones which come from the Urals and the Caucasus. The room was completed in 1770. Now, the particular interest of this room is more to do with the Second World War, and we'll come on to the Second World War in a while. In 1941, the Germans took time to totally dismantle this room, and they did that within some 36 hours, and they shipped all of the amber back to Königsberg in East Prussia. And then it was lost. It simply disappeared. And a new amber room, the one which you actually see here, is not the original, obviously, was recreated in 1982 at a cost, just that room, of £12 million. Another place, also inspired by the French, the very name of Hermitage is a French word, is a state Hermitage museum founded by Catherine the Great, and also in the 1780s, as you can see, was looking to France again for inspiration, but also for items of collection. And they would literally go over to France and bring back from France thousands of items to adorn the palaces. Now, the Hermitage is possibly the greatest museum in the world, and the bulk of the collection is in the Winter Palace. What we're looking at here is Raphael's Loggia, which is an exact copy of the 16th century gallery in the Vatican. Now, of much interest, and why when you walk along it, you don't look forward, but you look up, is because as you walk along, you look at the ceiling with a beautiful art, and it is known as the Bible on the ceiling. There are 52 frescoes on 13 bays, 12 Old Testament scenes from creation to Adam, to Noah, to Abraham, Jacob, Moses, Joshua, David, etc. And finally, one scene of the New Testament, and that is one scene of Jesus Christ. And this is very similar to the Sistine Chapel as well. Now, the original of the Vatican is by Raphael, and although this is called Raphael's Loggia, it is actually a creation by an artist known as Quarenghi. So it isn't, in that way, it's not done in any way by Raphael. Now, the Hermitage, if you attempt to walk around the Hermitage and see everything that there is to see, you could literally spend years. And it is not something that anybody should do. But when you go there, when eventually you'll go there, the war has ended, and you go to the Hermitage, like many, many art galleries, you select out just 8 or 10 pieces and concentrate on seeing those because they are the most magnificent, the most interesting, the most special, the greatest of the artist's work. And this one is where they had many Western European art, is considered one of the finest in the world. They have amongst the Rubens, the Rembrandts, Leonardo's, Titian, Michelangelo's, they have here one by Rembrandt, which is a portrait of an old Jew, painted, as it says, in 1654. Now, this excites many of the art critics and many of those to do with the Hermitage because it is a painting about which they know very little. And from the painting, they try and judge the visage, the manner, the way, the lifestyle of a particular Jew living in Amsterdam at that time when Rembrandt lived, and he lived amongst Jews within Amsterdam. And they look at his face and they see within his wrinkles and his sunken eyes and his grey beard and his rather slouched look, they see somehow a Jew suffering, as it were, that of being a Jew, but his weary look giving rise to a hard life. Now, when going into the Hermitage, you can easily miss things. One of the most special paintings that anyone with a feel for history and theology and Christianity and Judaism and their relationship is a painting done, as it says, between 1528 and 1531, which is a painting known as the Allegory of the Old and New Testament by Benvenuto Tisi, or Il Garofalo. And this painting is not just an ordinary painting. This is a painting which is amplified and exemplified throughout Northern Europe over and over again, which we see in sculptures from cathedrals all over England and much of Germany and France as well. What we have here is a classic example of a Christian artist portraying Christian theology and telling the viewer what he wants to tell you, the difference between Judaism and Christianity. Here we have the center of the painting, well divided between a right and a left. And Jesus Christ here is on a cross, which is very different with arms outstretched. Above Jesus Christ there is INRI, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. But he is below here paradise. And God himself is in paradise with some of his angels. And Jesus is directly below. So it's telling you that Jesus is below God. But on the one side, there is the Christian, and on the other side, the Jew. The Christian is called ecclesia, and the Jew is called synagoga. And these words are there, ecclesia, synagoga. The church. I am trying to tell you Christian theology. The church in this piece of painting, this painting there in the Hermitage, is of the Queen, a woman with a beautiful crown on. She's connected to Jesus Christ with her arm. She's wearing a magnificent gown, and she's surrounded by people that are colorful and ornate and glorious animals as well. She represents the church. And the comparison is the synagogue. And the synagogue is represented by a person, a woman, sitting on an ass. And she is a mess. She is unkempt, a naked foot, a cloak which is just unkempt as well. She has a crown, but the crown of the church is on, and the crown of the Jew has fallen off. She is holding a stave in her hand, but the stave is broken in half, while the stave for the church is complete and total. But more importantly, and fundamental to Christian-Jewish relations and the supersession of the church over the synagogue, is that she has a mask, something on her head which covers her eyes, in order to tell you, the viewer, that the synagogue and the Jew is blind to the truth of Christianity. And this painting continues, and people throng around this painting in the Hermitage, is here of the church during they have the wafer and the wine, and people are beautifully dressed and looking ornate. But on the other side is the high priest with animals and people looking not colorful at all, a bit of a mess. And they are driven towards the gate here, where the devil lies. But the Jew on his side has the key to the devil. Now, this painting is one of the most famous paintings of the Hermitage, and the Hermitage itself, just to leave this matter of the Hermitage, is called that because this was the way that the French used to escape from their homes in order to dwell in a room outside the major area of the palace where they would sit and consider life itself. And they would be in quietude, and they would be sedate, and they would be removed from other people. And that is why, and that leads you to the idea of a hermit, who is a person removed from society and comes from the Greek word for hermit, which comes from the Greek word for the desert, because a desert is a place of complete removal, as it were, from society. Now, whilst dealing with Christianity, we come to the center of the area where in 1917 was majorly affected, and you can still see the bullet holes in the hotel directly opposite, which was the 1917 revolution. This is the glorious Christian object of St. Isaac's Cathedral. You can see here built over some 40 years. Now, it is named, as we've already said, after the patron saint of Peter the Great, and is one of the largest Russian Orthodox cathedrals in the world. And it has been the center of controversy, for when it became state property by the Soviets in 1931, the state has refused to give it back to the church. And it is involved, you can still read letters about this and correspondence, is involved in a fight to return the church to the Russian Orthodox, and has been even involved in accusations of anti-Semitism, which is a bit of a stretch, but it's always possible. As of today, it is still a museum and is not returned to the church. And in 1931, a Foucault pendulum was placed in the cathedral to demonstrate the Earth's rotation. The pendulum is 98 meters long. What is interesting about this church is that normally when Jews go into a church, like anybody else, they would remove their hats. On a particular group I was with, and you would think of Russia of all places, there were people who were wearing head covering. And the administrator of the church came over to the group leader, the Russian speaker, and said they have to take their hats off. And the Russian guide said, well, actually, they're Jewish, and therefore they wear it for religious reasons. And the authority of the church said, well, in that case, it's absolutely okay, which was rather interesting, actually. But there are other Jewish aspects to this city as well. Now, here we are at the National Library of Russia, established in 1795. And it is the oldest public library in Russia. It contains millions of titles and hundreds of thousands of objects. And its most important objects are manuscripts of the New Testament, the Codex Sinaiticus, from around the year 340, and what is known here as the Leningrad Codex from about 1008. 1008 of the Common Era, and was probably written by Samuel ben Yaakov, and then has a whole history of its existence that eventually was found by a Karaite scholar known as Abraham Virkovich, and it was taken by him to Odessa in 1838 and later to St. Petersburg. Interestingly enough, it survived the siege of Leningrad between 1941 and 44 without any damage at all. When you go in, if you have an ability to go in and see this Leningrad Codex, I've said, is absolutely special. And the man who looks after it is an expert in Hebrew, an expert in Aramaic, but is not Jewish. But that is the story. And when you go into the library there, it's quite old in its style and its way, and even in the way it looks after all the objects. Now we come to one of the most important years in Russian history and the beginning of the end, you could say, of the rule of the Tsars. And 1881 is a defining moment in Russian, but even more so, of Jewish history. Now, for a number of years, revolution was bubbling up in Russia with the discontent under the Tsars, and the Tsars, instead of dealing with it, instead of changing, and where they did change for a little bit, they tended to suppress any movement trying to get away with, well, if keep the Tsars, but have a bit of democracy. And eventually, in 1881, whilst the Tsar was traveling through on his carriage, a bomb was thrown at the Tsar. Amazingly, of all the Tsars they wanted to assassinate, Alexander II was probably the most enlightened of the Tsars and began to give more rights to Jews and to other people than most of all of the Tsars had done before him. But nonetheless, in March 1881, a bomb was thrown at the carriage, and stupidly, as was said by the people who were around him, he actually got out of his carriage to confront the man who had thrown the bomb in order to discuss with him what's going on. At that moment, a second bomb was thrown, and that blew off, as it were, the legs of the Tsar, and he soon died when he was taken into the palace. Now, the assassins were a group of revolutionaries who were known as People's Will and Narodnaya Volya, excuse my accent, People's Will. Now, they were one of little known extreme revolutionary groups, and they really had absolutely nothing to do with the Jews. Coincidentally, however, one of the people in the group who blew off the legs of the Tsar was this lady here of Hestia Helfman, who was Jewish, even if she didn't really see herself as Jewish in any particular way. Now, she was, amongst, with all the others of the revolutionaries who were caught, was sentenced to death. But in her case, she was pregnant. And in Russian law at that time, a pregnant woman could not be put to death. Therefore, they would have to wait until she gave birth before putting her to death. And she was held in that very Peter and Paul fortress, which we've seen before, where the founder of Chabad Lubavitch was kept twice, and she would die from massive bleeding. Now, there are many who would say they deliberately allowed her to die of bleeding. They had no intention of trying to save her life. The baby was born, and the baby just disappeared, was probably put to death. No one knows what actually happened to the baby. But Russian history was not to be the same again. If in St. Petersburg you go to the spot where the Tsar was assassinated, you come to the church of the Savior of Spilled Blood. Well, I don't need to tell you that it's a magnificent, magnificent church. It contains all those architectural magnificence and beauties that you see within Russia, the onion domes and all the color, and it is just wonderful. And when you go in there, you can go through the main doors and you turn to the right and you go to the spot, which they say is the very spot where the assassination took place and where his blood was. And therefore they built the church over that very spot, thus the spilled blood. Now, it was built by the Romanovs in 1883, Tsar Alexander III, and continued on in 1907 by Nicholas II. And it contains magnificent art. And much of the art, of course, as with many churches and cathedrals around the world, contains a lot of Judaic interest and many of the Old Testament artistic appreciations as well. Unfortunately, if you have Russian guides, the actual guides don't always know what the art is. And there was a wonderful one where the guide said to me, this painting here is an example of where King Saul converted to Christianity. To which I said to her, I very much doubt whether it was King Saul who converted to Christianity, as he was the first king of Israel and existed however long it was, 1,000 years before the arrival of Jesus. And she said to me, no, 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 no. It is King Saul who converted to Christianity. I said, no, 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 no. It isn't. But in the end, I thought I'd just leave it for that. But anyway, there's much art, and there are some 7,000 mosaics within this church as well. With the happenings of 1881, it wasn't long before a new word entered into Russian and thereby universal language, and that was the word pogrom, which many say in Russian comes from the word pogrom, like thunder. It was triggered by the assassination, even though the Jews, as such, were not to blame and had really nothing to do with it. The pogroms swept through southwest of the Russian Empire. The picture on the left is actually of the expulsion of the Jews from Kiev, and then encouraged by the mob, the government, it is said, the press, and others, thousands of Jewish homes were destroyed. Jews were murdered. 166 towns were pillaged. And we know what the mob does, and Jews were massacred, and it became part of the never-ending, it seemed, history of Jews being massacred. And although the word pogrom is used for occasions before 1881, nonetheless, this is really historically where the word comes into play. Now, the evil of the pogroms, whether it's the mob capturing Jews, murdering Jews, displacing Jews, is immortalized in verse and in literature, especially by Nachman Chaim Bialik, the great Hebrew poet who was there in Russia at the time of the pogroms. Now, interestingly enough, if you go there, there is also a magnificent synagogue which was allowed and built at the time of Tsar Alexander II, who allowed the synagogue to be built as long as it was not going to be any higher than the height of the Winter Palace. And this is quite common in Europe, where you weren't allowed to build buildings, certainly synagogues, which would be higher than certain other buildings, such as churches. Now, it wasn't to be higher than the Winter Palace, and it certainly wasn't. It is in a classic Moorish style, which we see so often. You see in Hungary, you see in Germany, you see in many other places, because they refer, the Moorish style lends itself to this concept that Jews, Muslims, and Christians lived under the Moorish regimes, countries, in a sort of conviviality, a sort of goodness between each faith, whether it was true or not. Now, it's actually, for any of you who have been to Berlin, this particular synagogue was modeled partially on the Orangier Bürgerstrasse synagogue in Berlin, which you can still see the facade of. It's still there with the museum behind it, which was actually destroyed in the main by Allied bombing. The synagogue was dissolved, built in 1893, but dissolved in 1917 with the revolution, when you were not allowed to hold services, and it was bombed by the Germans. But today it is restored, and it is functioning as the main synagogue of the Soviet Union. By the beginning of the 20th century, and especially 1905, well, the writing was on the wall for the Tsars, even if they couldn't see it. In front of the Winter Palace, which you can see here, another magnificent square with magnificent buildings. The classic Moorish style is not in this building at all, but it's a very classic way that you saw in the Winter Palace as well, and the Summer Palace. On the Bloody Sunday in 1905, this was a scene, as it says here, the Bloody Sunday Massacre, when people wanted to revolt and appeal for better rights under the Tsars. And instead of the Tsars reacting and allowing for greater freedom for their citizens. They went through with their soldiers and they shot down many, many people in that very square. And their strikes took place over 1905. The battleship Potemkin mutinied, and Jews again were attacked in pogroms in 1905. It was a dress rehearsal for 1917, whilst Nicholas II was slow in and inept at seeing the end was nigh. Now, one of the great personalities to be in when you go to St. Petersburg, you'll visit the area and you can actually go and to the very home where he was taken and then assassinated. He was an obscure monk-like figure, often binding the Tsar family to reality. He befriended the empress and was a faith healer to their son Alexei, who had hemophilia. And it is said that he could stop the bleeding of Alexei. Whether he did or he didn't, they believed, or certainly the Tsarina believed, that he had this power. Eventually and gradually, it was simply seen that Rasputin had too much power. He was an object in the way of what more powerful people worked with the Tsars wanted. And whilst Russia was losing the First World War, it was seen that Rasputin had to be got rid of. Now, to deal with the subject of Rasputin and who assassinated him and what was involvement with the British and English and different people is a subject for another time, but certainly worth reading about. And he was assassinated in 1916 in the Yusupov Palace, where you can go and visit. Now, it is said that he would receive poison, which didn't seem to affect him very much, which would really fit into the whole mystique of Rasputin. He was then shot more than once and didn't seem to die, which would fit in with the mystique of Rasputin. And eventually, on the outside, he was shot again and again until he did indeed die. Lenin came along. His name was Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, or Vladimir Lenin. And Lenin, interestingly enough, and it was kept entirely from Lenin himself, it is said that he actually had Jewish ancestry, which wouldn't have done him well, and that came through his mother. He led the revolution, and the bold Bolsheviks declared a new government in what was then, of course, now called Petrograd. They changed the name. And then, of course, they would change the name again under Lenin. The painting is by Isaac Brodsky, who was a Jewish artist who actually was friendly with Lenin. And he died in 1939, and his apartment is a national monument in St. Petersburg. If one wants to define Russian history in the modern period, one wants to even attempt to examine Russia's attitude to the world, if one wants to look at the way Russia treats its neighbors, whether it be the Ukraine or others, one has to look back to the Second World War. Germany actually had, as we know, with Molotov, had an agreement with the Russians, and the Russians had an agreement with Germany that they were somehow allies. And when Poland was attacked by the Germans, the Russians stood back and then took over the other half of Poland. Interestingly enough, from a perspective of politics, England went to war, or Britain went to war against the Germany, for they said if you attack Poland, we go to war. The Russians attacked Poland, but of course we didn't go to war against Russia. In fact, Russia was our ally eventually. Now, many of the things which they say about Lenin Stalin and others, that of course, in the whole period leading up to in this era of the beginning, the Cold War, the 1939, 1940, is that they were completely blinded to the reality of what was going on in Germany. For Hitler had said in Mein Kampf and many other places that the ultimate enemy of Russia would, of course, be the Soviets. This was communism. This was intrinsically, in every way possible, in the very guts of German thinking, Nazi thinking, they were the very enemy par excellence. When you go into St. Petersburg, you drive from the airport and you come through the road from the airport into St. Petersburg, you come across a magnificent memorial known as the Victory Square Memorial, with a column thrusting into the sky of 150 feet, with buildings on either side, right and left, and just bringing this square together. Music emanates, whether it's Shostakovich or others, emanates from out of the square here. And all of these models are absolutely classic models of the Soviet era. And interestingly enough, having just been in Poland and in Warsaw, the memorial in Warsaw to the war is also very much in the same style, the same type of soldiers holding the same type of rifles, looking in the same proud and upright in how they fought off the Nazi hordes. This memorial is at the very spot where the last Nazi tank got towards St. Petersburg. It didn't get any further, and that where the tank stopped is where this memorial is built. Now, one can enter into this museum also and see a very powerful number of slides and films about what went on in Leningrad. The Russians were defined by a siege of Leningrad, which went on for 900 days. And the deaths of the Russians who died from starvation at this period was 4 times greater than Hiroshima and Nagasaki put together. The Germans had attacked June 1941 and expected a quick victory. But as Heinrich Heine said about Napoleon, the problem with Napoleon is that his geography teacher never taught him that Russia has cold winters, and obviously never quite taught Hitler either. But Russia's vastness and weather stopped the Wehrmacht. Under siege and during one of the coldest winters in memory, the Soviets were starved, even to cannibalism. And in December, then January and February of 1942, around 96,000 citizens starved to death. By mid-1942, Germany's defeat was inevitable. And to realize a breakthrough of German lines, Shostakovich, to celebrate that moment after 900 days, Shostakovich's 7th Symphony was played on loudspeakers throughout that part of Leningrad and then cascaded over the front line of the German troops. And it is said, whilst they said in the Battle of Leningrad, Leningrad is free, the Germans said when they heard the music, they knew they were defeated. By the end of the war, 750,000 people in Leningrad had starved to death. And now you can begin to understand the Soviet attitude to the West in a way. But let us end with a bit of beauty. Let's end more or less with a bit of beauty. In the Shuvalov Palace in 2013 was established the House of Fabergé. These are beautiful objects and some of the most valuable pieces in the world. And we've seen here throughout these slides beauty and awfulness, but a lot of beauty. And these were Easter eggs which were collected by by Fabergé for the 2 last Russian czars. Seen on the right is the Lily of the Valley. This is the 15th anniversary, a gift to Tsarina Alexandra from her husband Nicholas II. on the 15th anniversary of the coronation and is valued at some $15 million. Here, the most famously, the one at the lower left, was made in 1897 and is made of gold and reflects the gold color of the material hewn by the Tsarina in her coronation in 1897 or thereabout. The coach is a replica of the coach that carried the Tsarina to her coronation in Moscow. The value of this is $100 million and more. I've just come back from Poland, and whilst in St. Petersburg it is not dwelled on the Holocaust in the same way, but there is just outside of St. Petersburg, which at some times would be included within the St. Petersburg borough, as it were, and hushed up by the Soviets because, of course, Jews never killed, they were just Soviets. And a monument, therefore, eventually was established in 1991 after pressure from 1980. And despite a history of anti-Jewish hatred, poverty, pogroms, Holocaust, Soviet subjugation, Jews still survived and still lived. Of this particular incident, 250 to 300 Jews were murdered by the Nazis in 1941. Sidor, who is known as the Soviet, as it says here, Henry Moore, composed or constructed this leaning over, suffering Jew who is suffering from the indignation of life and what became under the Nazis. I will end with a quote from Winston Churchill. Winston Churchill said, looking at the whole history of the Jews of Russia, who had, as I've said, withstood pogroms and Holocaust and starvation and the Soviets and communism and on and on and on, said, some people like Jews and some do not, but no thoughtful man can doubt the fact that they are beyond all question the most formidable and the most remarkable race which has ever appeared in the world. Thank you very much. I'm happy to take some questions if there are any. Over to you.
Thank you very much. We have a listener wondering, the city is magnificent, the story is great. Why did you choose this topic exactly now?
Well, I chose it exactly now because I'm always interested in St. Petersburg. I follow Holocaust studies and wartime studies intensely. And in a way, I miss going to St. Petersburg and the way of celebrating or commemorating the fact that I can't go to St. Petersburg now and nobody can. Um, I thought I would spend time showing you, if you've never been there before, a very, very special city that sooner than later you'll be able to actually go to.
Wondering, how is the Leningrad Codex similar to and different from the Aleppo Codex, which is older?
Right, yes. Now, this is an interesting one because the Aleppo Codex is not complete. It is older, and in many ways is more magnificent, but it is not complete. The Leningrad Codex is a complete edition. So that in that way, that's why it's treasured.
How many Jews remain in the Soviet Union?
Unknown, unknown. Nobody knows. You go round. People always love to know about numbers. How many are there today? And you go round the Soviet Union or any of Eastern Europe, it's remarkable there are actually any Jews at all. You could probably just Google that one. But even then, when you get a Google result to it and it tells you there are 100,000 Jews or 90,000 Jews, it's unlikely to be accurate. There are often many more Jews than one knows about because many people do not want to admit to being Jewish because they look back and they see it as not a particularly good idea. So it the same way applies in Hungary and it is in Poland and, as I said, Romania and all of Eastern Europe. So the numbers, as I say, is a guesstimate. It's just a guesstimate.
Um, Someone is noting when I went to St. Petersburg about 25 years ago, our guide told us that during the siege, they ate all the animals, dogs, cats, etc., and that people were even chewing on leather belts and such like at that time.
Yes, and that's absolutely true. And they because this was the only way they could literally survive. There was simply no other way. It was incredibly difficult to actually get out of St. Petersburg. There was a route out through the lakes to one particular area which was not surrounded by the Germans. But the problem was that it was water and it would only freeze in certain times of the winter. And they used to have a system whereby they would try and measure the depth of the ice. And judging the depth of the ice, they'd go out with rulers and judge it. And a certain depth, they would reckon you could walk on the ice. And a certain greater depth, you could then get a small horse-drawn carriage on. And then greater depth, you could get vehicles. Um, but it was remarkably unreliable, and it only, of course, happened much later. So people starving will eat anything. What's the point of having animals if you were starving to death? To survive, people would eat anything. And as I said, people actually ate other human beings. There were those who refused to do it, and probably those that refused to do it died. But that was one of the awfulness. It is just an awful, awful history.
Thank you. Um, Shelley asks, have you heard the theory that Stalin dismantled and hid the Amber Room, expecting that Hitler would loot it?
No. A quick answer on that one. I think that would go against the generally known knowledge that it was actually seen as being taken off to Königsberg. So, but who can know conspiracy theories? But who would know in history what goes on? I mean, it's as bad or as good a theory as any other. But in general, it is known that it went to Königsberg, and in Königsberg, it disappeared. So maybe it's somewhere around there in a mine or somewhere else.
Someone is asking, are the street signs all in Cyrillic? How do tourists manage? Someone else notes that the signs are in English script as well.
Right,
Maybe.
by now, or when I say by now, that was the last time I went, of course, which was before COVID. There are some street signs a little more in English, but it's not as bad as somewhere like China where there's very little. There are street signs and you can get around, and some people do speak uh, English. So that's not impossible in that sense. You'll be able to get around when you get there.
We have just some comments here about St. Petersburg. One listener says they visited St. Petersburg in 2018, a beautiful city. In World War II, all the artworks from the heritage were sent to Siberia. Someone else says a trip to St. Petersburg is at the top of my bucket list. And another person notes Putin is a native of St. Petersburg and the town is his pride.
Right. So I hope to also go back to St. Petersburg. So just stay with me on my tours and just come along. Just go back and repeat those first question again. Hello. Just
Sorry.
repeat the first question again.
Yeah, they were just um, comments all, but in this person notes that in World War II, all the artworks from the heritage were sent to
Yeah.
Siberia.
Okay. Okay. On that one, from the Hermitage, the artwork was collected. You could read in books, and you can see there are many pictures of how they dealt with the art. And the art, much of it was collected and boxed up and taken away in cars and all to all different places. Some of it was stored in the basement of the Hermitage, and much went off to, as you say, to Siberia. Much of that which went off, of course, came back again, and you can go there and you can see most of the art. Yeah.
Lindy asks, can you talk about the significance of the White Knights celebrations on the canals of St. Petersburg?
I really can't. So I'll have to leave you on that one.
Thank you.
That one.
Can you tell us again the name of the sculpture that is still on the screen?
That one is there. If you just roll back your, it's called The Formula of Grief by Vadim Sidor. So that's there on the slide, which is in front of you.
Thank you.
Okay, we'll take just two more questions.
Okay. Um, Ruth is asking, can you elaborate on Lenin's Jewish link?
Ah, again, it is said, but you can read about it that there was some relationship in the marriage, but to do with his grandfather and his grandmother, or and that there was a Jewish link there. They were absolutely certain. It was nothing that special, and he it is said never knew about it, but others did, and it is only after his death that they actually stated it to be so. It's a bit contrived. I wouldn't dwell on that too much, like so many of these things.
Last question Barbara's asking, were Jews conscripted into the Soviet army after 1917?
Absolutely, the number of Jews that fought for the Soviets in the World War One, there were something like 600 in World War One, something like between 450 and 600,000 Jewish soldiers that fought despite discrimination, because there was always discrimination. And it is said that around 100,000 Jews died fighting for the Russians. Around that, we would imagine that the numbers that fought for Russia in the Second World War were much the same, and the casualties probably the same as well.
Thank you so much. There were lots of other comments of appreciation and praise for the city, for your lecture today. So thank you
I
very
should
much for
just
being with
I
us.
should just say, continuing the theme, my one on Kelso will be very much in the theme of today, but it's not quite as beautiful, but more worrying. But thank you very much.
Thank you. We look forward to seeing you another couple weeks' time, I think it
Thanks.
is.
Bye.
Bye. Good night. Good
Good
evening,
night.
everyone.